I think the issue here is that China can threaten war, but it's going to have difficulty waging one. For one thing, China has never fought a naval war, at least since 1895 when it was defeated by the Japanese. It has a lot of hardware, but the humanware, the trained admirals who have drawn on an institutional memory of warfare, aren't there. It is opening this by claiming that it is going to have an amphibious operation against Taiwan. Nothing is harder than an amphibious operation for two reasons. Firstly, getting the men to the right place is very tough, as we learned in Operation Overlord and other things in the Pacific. Secondly, you have to keep resupplying them. And the ships that are coming to resupply these men are highly vulnerable to air attacks. So the reason we are not going to have a war is, one, the United States has no desire to have a war with the Chinese, nor isn't it planning to allow the Chinese to dominate the Western Pacific. And the Chinese really don't have a geographical and strategic position where they can carry out an attack. And the biggest problem the Chinese have is they may lose. Whenever you start a war, as the Americans have learned in Vietnam and Iraq and other places, don't assume that you're going to win. And in the case of the United States, well, we endured the defeats. China has built itself internally as a heroic power. If it were to invade or try to invade Taiwan and lost, the regime would, I think, face serious challenge at home as to how that could have happened. So it's much better to threaten than to do. And therefore, I don't think either side is going to attack. The U.S. has nothing to gain from attacking China. We can't go anywhere. We can't go on shore. There's millions of them. And the Chinese have too much at risk to carry out that war. And in a sense, that's the same thing as why the Cold War ended the way it did. Each side was afraid of war. The Russians were terrified that it would lose a war. The Americans and the Russians were both frightened of nuclear weapons. The Americans had no reason to attack. They were just waiting. That's the game the Americans usually play. And in the end, what was the point? That was the interesting thing, that it ended in a whimper. The Russians went away. So I think it is like the Cold War. And like the Cold War, it never turned into a hot one, and probably couldn't because everybody's afraid of one. So the Chinese, without any allies, facing the possibility of dealing with the largest and most powerful navy in the world, and a very experienced one, is bluffing hostile actions. The United States is bluffing blockading Chinese ports, because we're there in the South China Sea. We could close them off. We could close off the Straits of Malacca. Okay. Well, we have no intention of doing that. That would start a war. And the Chinese don't have anything. So what we're having here is not a reference back to the Cold War. It's the simple interplay between nation states that have serious issues with each other, none of which warrant combat, where each side tries to bluff the other into backing off. The difference is the Chinese are isolated and therefore have only a bluff. The United States is sitting there with an alliance structure that is really larger than NATO was, sitting back and not responding. Of course, the media will get all excited about this. They'll think that the Chinese have said they're going to invade Taiwan. Well, one of the guarantees is that if you're planning to invade a place, you don't name it months ahead, because the other side can build up. And so we know that's not going to happen. China's problem is naval. The Russians, I'm sorry, so it shows my age. The Russians do not have significant help they could provide the Chinese in confronting the West. The Russian confrontation in Ukraine or further west is ground warfare. The Russians don't need that kind of help. What the Russians need is tremendous investment out of China. That they would like. They still couldn't help the Chinese. What the Chinese would like was the Russians buying more of their goods. Well, the Russians can only buy so much. So when you look at an alliance, when you look at the Cold War and you saw the American alliance with, say, Britain beforehand, the two militaries were intertwined. The economy of Britain was dependent on the economy of the United States. The land of the United States was dependent on the invasion of Europe. This was an alliance in which each side had something to offer. In fact, were indispensable to the other. In the case of Russia and China, it's a concept, but when you take a look at how they would bear the burden of each other, Russia is not prepared to attack the West because it depends on Europe to buy its products. It would be in particularly its oil. It's not going to do that. And it can't do that. Its military isn't strong enough. The Chinese are going to be coping with the Americans and the Japanese and everyone else by themselves. The Russians can't come. So it would be another thing, to declare themselves allies. That's nice. Now, what are you going to do about it? Well, that becomes much more difficult. So alliance is a piece of paper, a working alliance. Look at the U.S. and Britain, World War II, or the U.S. and Australia. So the problem here is there's one thing they could do. Simultaneously attack the United States. Russia by attacking Europe and NATO. China by attacking the fleet. That would be an interesting cooperation. The problem is the Russians are not that strong, and they're highly dependent on their relationship with Europe. They don't want to destroy Europe, God knows. And the Chinese, without that, are on their own, as they are now. So the really important thing when you talk about international relations are the details. You use various terms, relationships, alliances, many, many things. But when you ask the question, what exactly does that mean? What are you going to do for each other? Well, that's an issue. And this is the problem with China today. It puts itself as an adversarial relationship with the United States. It still has access to U.S. markets. That hasn't been cut off. Just some prices change. Were the U.S. to cut off their access to the United States, this would be a devastating blow. They don't want that to happen. We don't want that to happen. So we have this kabuki play, kind of like a New Zealand haka, and we're threatening each other, but we don't mean it. We don't expect a war with China. The Chinese don't expect a war with us. The Russians certainly don't. They're desperately trying to rebuild their economy, don't want to go into a war. We are in a peaceful period, not with small countries, but the great powers have far more to lose than they could gain in a war. And the risks to each of them are way too high. U.S. is not going to attack China or Russia. Russia is not going to attack Europe, and the Chinese are not going to engage the U.S. fleet and everybody else in order to get more